All right, and this is usually the face that I get about this time in the class when I present this. So some people will say to me, look, if the birth stories are not historical, what value do they have, Bill? That would mean that they are nothing better than fables and old wives' tales. Well, that's what some people reacted to Raymond Brown when he presented this material. And Raymond Brown, and following his lead, I have to kind of respond, again, by asking you to forgive me for rather bluntly insisting that you pay attention to what Father Raymond Brown said. Brown did not say that the birth stories were not historical in any way. We gave reasons why scholars think that some, even many, of the events described in these stories may not be historical. There are historical details in the birth narratives, although neither Matthew's nor Luke's narrative is completely historical. We should emphasize that, besides disagreeing on certain matters, back to Lucy's question, the two evangelists also agree on what might be called the most important parts. Both Matthew and Luke have an enunciation of the future greatness of the child before the child's birth, meaning they both agree on a providential, God's providence, providential divine preparation, and indeed a revelation. Both Matthew and Luke agree that the child Jesus was conceived without a human father, the astounding claim for the virginal conception. Correct? I'm telling you what they agree on. Both Matthew and Luke agree that the child was of the house of David through the Davidic heritage of Joseph, and both Matthew and Luke agree that the birth took place in the city of Bethlehem. We'll explore later why they may have been in Bethlehem, when history tends to suggest they were probably originally from Nazareth. That doesn't mean that Luke is more historically accurate than Matthew. It just means one of these texts occasionally gets things more historically accurate than the other. But that goes both ways, folks. Both Matthew and Luke agree that ultimately the family went to settle in Nazareth. Of course, in Matthew, it's because they were from Bethlehem, they had to flee to Egypt, and then they went to a totally new place, Nazareth, out of fear of Herod's descendants. In Luke, they're originally from Nazareth. There's no business with Herod. They go to Bethlehem because of a census. They stop by at Jerusalem, and then they go back to Nazareth to live, which is their hometown. Folks, what's on the screen are very important agreements, and Raymond Brown would argue that a case can be made for the historicity of such agreed details. That these are things that, you can argue that these things more or less actually happened. So we got the beginnings of Christmas. Maybe the tree is a little bit light, but I think with Linus that it's still it needs love, this Christmas tree. Don't you want to give some Christmas love to this tree, folks? Okay. Warning. Having too myopic a concern with historicity can blind people to the great value that the stories of Matthew chapter 1 and 2 and Luke chapter 1 and 2 have in themselves. Matthew's infancy narrative is a carefully done catechism of the basic message of the scriptures of Israel, meaning what we would call the Old Testament. In the genealogies, we have the stories of the patriarchs and the kings, really in Matthew's genealogy. We have the stories of the patriarchs and the kings recalled simply by the mention of the names, so that we are reminded that Jesus is the heir of the virtues associated with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon, etc. Raymond Brown suggested the significance of having even unknown names in the third tier, the third list of 14. as part of a message concerning a Messiah who would preach to the marginalized, the poor, the unknown, the nothing people, the Anawim. He pointed out that the prophetic message in Matthew's infancy narrative were an attempt to include in the message of Jesus' birth the testimony of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, all social prophets who talked about the people neglecting the widow and the orphan and the marginalized and the poor. Not so much that these are Nostradamus, Edgar Cayce predictions of the future, but to evoke what these ministries of these prophets was. The Matthean Joseph with his dreams and journey to Egypt evokes the Joseph in the book of Genesis, even who dreamed and saved Israel by bringing them to Egypt when the famine came. Even as Matthew's wicked king Herod, killing children, reminds us of the Pharaoh in Egypt who tried to destroy the baby Moses. Matthew clearly is retelling the story of Israel in his infancy narrative, Matthew chapter 1 and 2, because it is an essential introduction to the gospel proper, which begins with the baptism of Jesus by John the Dunker. The baptism by John the Dunker is itself a kind of typological play with the crossing of the Red Sea. Raymond Brown found a similar message in the Lucan infancy narrative, done with even more exquisite artistic balancing of details. There is a parallel between the Annunciation of the Dunker's birth and the Annunciation of Jesus' birth, culminating in the coming together of the two mothers. This is followed by another parallel between the birth and circumcision of the Dunker, hailed by a canticle, the Benedictus, and the birth, circumcision, and presentation of Jesus, hailed by a canticle, that of Simeon. The Old Testament motifs in Luke are even more subtle than in Matthew. Only if one knows very well the Bible will one recognize that the situation in Zechariah and Elizabeth is exactly like that of Abraham and Sarah, too aged and too barren to have a child, as we see in these texts. In Luke chapter 1, verse 18, Zechariah speaks the same words as Abraham speaks in Genesis 15, verse 8. Also, the presentation of Jesus in the temple before the aged Simeon strongly resembles the presentation of the prophet Samuel as a boy in the temple before the aged Eli, even as the canticle of Mary, called the Magnificat, strongly resembles the canticle of Samuel's mother, Hannah, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. Thus, by a type of superimposition, both evangelists Matthew and Luke are telling us of Old Testament scenes and characters who are preparations for Jesus. Brown also pointed out that each infancy narrative is in anticipation of the gospel and its proclamation. In each, Matthew and Luke, the basic message enunciated by an angel is that Jesus is God's Son, establishing the identity of the Messiah. In each, Matthew and Luke, the message is received with obedience by Joseph in Matthew and by Mary in Luke. In each, others come and adore, Magi in Matthew, shepherds in Luke, as a sign that the gospel will be received. In each, Matthew and Luke, there is also a rejection by Herod the chief priests and the scribes in Matthew, and also by unknown persons implied in the warning of Luke chapter 2, verse 34. This child is set for the fall and rise of many in Israel.